London, May 1867. The morning of her wedding arrived with unseasonable cold, gray clouds pressing low over the city, as if the heavens themselves disapproved. 28-year-old Lady Isabella Sinclair stood before the cracked mirror in her childhood bedroom, studying her reflection. A woman past the bloom of youth, her dark hair already threaded with silver at the temples, her face unremarkable by society's cruel standards. Today she would marry Alexander Thornwood, Duke of Ashford, a widower of 35, whose first wife had died 3 years prior under circumstances whispered about but never fully explained. The marriage had been arranged through intermediaries, a transaction of mutual convenience. The Duke required a respectable wife to manage his household and quiet the gossip. Isabella's impoverished family desperately needed the financial settlement such a connection would bring. She had met the Duke only twice, both times in formal settings where conversation remained stilted and proper. His expression was coldly polite, his gray eyes revealing nothing of the man beneath the title. He was handsome in a severe way, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and an air of absolute authority, but there was no warmth in him. Isabella harbored no romantic illusions about this union. She understood her role, a decorative, obedient duchess who managed his estates with quiet efficiency and produced an heir if fortune allowed. The bedroom door opened without ceremony. Her mother entered, her thin face set in its habitual expression of resigned martyrdom, the same look she had worn throughout Isabella's childhood whenever discussing the burdens and disappointments of marriage. Mrs. Sinclair closed the door firmly behind her, then turned to her daughter with the grim determination of a general preparing a soldier for battle. What followed was a conversation Isabella would never forget, words that would echo in her mind for hours to come, shaping her expectations and filling her with a cold, creeping dread. What would the Duke's first words be on their wedding night? Subscribe to Story Nook TV and hit the bell icon so you never miss our stories. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Her mother's advice was explicit, clinical, and utterly devoid of comfort. Tonight, when the Duke exercised his marital rights, Isabella must close her eyes and remain perfectly still, silent and unresponsive, making no sound that might suggest enjoyment or even awareness. A proper wife endured her husband's attentions without complaint, viewing the marriage bed as a duty owed, a price paid for security and respectability. She must never, under any circumstances, expect tenderness, consideration, or pleasure. Such things were not meant for women of virtue, her mother insisted, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. Men had their needs, base and animal, and women bore the burden of satisfying those needs while maintaining their dignity through absolute passivity. The intimacy of marriage, Mrs. Sinclair explained with clinical detachment, was something to be endured, survived, gotten through as quickly as possible. If Isabella remained still and silent, it would be over faster. If she showed any sign of participation, or, God forbid, enjoyment, her husband would think her wanton and lose all respect for her. Her role was submission, nothing more. Her comfort, her feelings, her body's responses were irrelevant to the transaction. This was what it meant to be a wife. Isabella listened to this counsel in numb silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling, her throat constricting with each cold instruction. She had known her parents' marriage was loveless, a union of obligation that had produced 3 daughters and decades of quiet resentment. But hearing her mother speak so clinically about marital intimacy as something to be endured rather than shared made Isabella's upcoming wedding night feel less like a beginning and more like a kind of death. She was to close her eyes, endure, and expect nothing. That was the sum total of her mother's wisdom after 29 years of marriage. When her mother finally left to see to last-minute preparations, Isabella remained seated before the mirror, staring at her own pale reflection with a hollow feeling expanding in her chest. This was her future. This was what marriage meant. She tried to steel herself, to find some reserve of courage or resignation that would carry her through the ordeal ahead, but all she felt was a profound, bone-deep dread settling over her like a shroud. The hours passed in a blur of preparation and movement. Her sister helped her into the simple cream silk gown, the best her family could afford, modest and appropriate for a bride past her first youth marrying into higher station. The small church filled with guests, mostly the Duke's connections, as Isabella's family had few friends of any social standing. Then the moment arrived, the organ's solemn notes filling the cold stone space, signaling that it was time. Isabella walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her mother's instructions echoing in her mind with every step, each word a weight pulling her down towards some dark inevitability. Close your eyes, endure, never expect pleasure. The mantra repeated itself with the rhythm of her heartbeat as she approached the altar where the Duke waited, his tall figure imposing in his formal attire, his expression as unreadable as ever. She could not see kindness in his face, she could not see warmth, she saw only the cold aristocratic reserve of a man fulfilling an obligation. The ceremony proceeded with formal propriety, the vicar's words washing over her in a distant drone as she stood beside this stranger who would own her body and soul according to the laws of church and crown. She spoke her vows in a voice that sounded distant to her own ears, promising to love, honor, and obey. The Duke's responses came measured and correct, his deep voice betraying no emotion whatsoever. Then came the moment for the ring. The Duke took her left hand in his, and Isabella braced herself, expecting the same cold formality that had characterized every interaction between them. But as Alexander Thornwood slid the golden band onto her finger, his touch was unexpectedly gentle, his large hand cradling hers with a carefulness that seemed almost protective. His thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture so brief and subtle that Isabella almost thought she had imagined it. For one fleeting moment, his gray eyes met hers, and she saw something flicker in their depths, something that was not quite coldness, something that whispered of complexity beneath his reserved exterior. The moment passed as quickly as it came. The vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and the Duke released her hand, stepping back into his habitual reserve. But that small touch, that unexpected gentleness, had planted a seed of uncertainty in Isabella's mind, a tiny question mark against the certainty of her mother's grim predictions. Would the wedding night truly be the cold endurance her mother described? Or might the Duke prove different from the brutal, selfish husband she had been taught to expect? The wedding breakfast passed in a haze of forced smiles and polite conversation, wealthy guests toasting the new Duchess of Ashford, while Isabella sat frozen beside her husband, her mother's instructions repeating in her mind like a funeral bell. Close your eyes, endure, never expect pleasure. When evening finally fell and the last guests departed, the Duke stood and extended his hand to her with formal politeness. Isabella rose on trembling legs, her heart pounding violently as he led her through the grand halls of Ashford House toward the ducal apartments. Every step felt like walking toward her own execution. They reached his chambers, and before Isabella could steel herself further, the Duke swept her up into his arms, carrying her across the threshold. She went rigid in his embrace, every muscle locked, her eyes squeezing shut as her mother's voice echoed louder than ever. Stay still, stay silent, endure. But instead of carrying her to the bed as she anticipated, he stopped just inside the room and set her feet gently on the floor. She waited for him to begin undressing her, to claim his rights with the cold efficiency her mother had described. He did none of those things. Instead, he stepped back, putting distance between them, and spoke words that made her eyes fly open in shock. "Your pleasure comes first. Always." Isabella stared at him, certain she had misheard, but Alexander gestured toward a chair near the fireplace with unexpected gentleness. "Please, sit. We need to talk before anything else happens between us." She moved toward the chair on unsteady legs, her mind struggling to make sense of this man who was supposed to take what he wanted without consideration, but instead seemed intent on conversation. He poured 2 glasses of wine, bringing one to her before taking a seat across from her, maintaining careful distance. "I need to tell you about my first wife," he began quietly. "Her name was Catherine, and I destroyed her through my own arrogance and adherence to society's cruel expectations of what a husband should be." He spoke of his first marriage with raw honesty, describing how he had been cold, distant, and demanding, expecting Catherine to submit without question, to endure his attentions without complaint, to be decorative and dutiful and nothing more. "She withered under that treatment," he said, growing paler and sadder until I barely recognized her. "She died 3 years ago, a death that could have been prevented if she had trusted me enough to speak of her suffering. But I had never given her reason to trust me. I crushed her spirit through thoughtless adherence to convention, through my assumption that her feelings, her comfort, her very self did not matter beyond what convenience she could provide me." After Catherine died, Alexander continued, leaning forward with intensity in his gray eyes. He swore he would never repeat that mistake. "True intimacy cannot be taken or endured. It must be built through trust, through genuine care, through communication and mutual desire. Your body belongs to you, not to me by virtue of a marriage contract. When and if we share physical intimacy, it will be because you wish it, because you desire it, because it brings you pleasure and joy, not because you are steeling yourself to survive an ordeal." The words struck Isabella like blows, each one dismantling another piece of the worldview her mother had constructed in her mind. "But you have rights as my husband," she whispered, her voice trembling with confusion. "The law, the church, they give you authority over me. Why would you care about my pleasure when society tells you my only purpose is to serve yours?" Alexander's expression grew weary but determined. "Because society's script destroyed my first marriage. Because I have learned at terrible cost that a relationship built on power and submission rather than partnership creates only misery for both people involved. And because, Isabella, you deserve better than to spend your life merely enduring the touch of a man who should cherish you." The silence that followed felt heavy with possibility and revolution, the air between them charged with something that challenged every assumption Isabella had ever held about marriage and duty. She sat in that chair, staring at this man who was legally her master, but who offered equality instead, patience instead of demands, pleasure instead of endurance. Slowly, hesitantly, a tiny spark of something precious and dangerous began to kindle in her chest. Hope. Hope that perhaps her mother had been wrong, that perhaps marriage did not have to be the grim endurance she had been taught to expect, that perhaps this dupe meant what he said. "I propose," Alexander continued, his voice gentle, "that we spend the coming weeks simply learning to know one another, building friendship and trust before anything else. I want you to feel safe with me, Isabella. I want you to understand that when you come to my bed, if you choose to, it will be as an equal, not as property to be used." Isabella's hands trembled around her wineglass. "I don't know how to be an equal," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been taught my entire life to be silent, to submit, to make myself small and unobtrusive. I don't know who I am beyond those instructions." "Then we'll discover who you are together," Alexander said, and the warmth in his voice made something crack open inside her. "Tell me, what do you think about when you're alone? What makes you angry? What makes you laugh? What dreams did you have before you were told to stop dreaming?" The questions were so unexpected, so revolutionary that Isabella found herself speechless. No one had ever asked her such things. No one had ever cared what she thought or felt beyond how well she performed her assigned duties. She began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. Alexander smiled, a real smile that softened his severe features and made him look almost boyish. "We have time. There's no rush. Would you like to tell me about your childhood, your favorite books, anything at all that you wish to share?" And so Isabella began, falteringly at first, to speak her own thoughts for perhaps the first time to someone who seemed genuinely interested in hearing them. She told him about the books she'd hidden under her bed as a girl, novels her mother would have burned if she'd found them, stories of adventure and independence that had nothing to do with dutiful daughters and silent wives. She confessed her fascination with the stars, how she would sneak to her window at night to study the constellations, dreaming of worlds beyond her confined existence. Alexander listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed he truly heard her, that he valued what she had to say. As the hours passed and the candles burned low, Isabella felt the first cracks forming in the armor of resignation she had worn for so long. The wedding night she had dreaded was turning into something she had never imagined possible, a conversation between equals, the revolutionary beginning of learning that she might deserve more than mere survival in her own marriage. 3 weeks passed in a manner Isabella had never imagined possible, each day unfolding like the pages of a novel she had never dared to read. Alexander proved true to his word, treating their marriage as a courtship rather than a completed transaction. They took long afternoon walks through the sprawling gardens of his country estate, where he asked her opinions on everything from the design of the rose beds to her thoughts on parliamentary reform, listening with genuine interest as she discovered she had strong views on topics she had been taught were beyond a woman's concern. They shared leisurely breakfasts where conversation flowed easily, discussing books and philosophy and the changing world around them. In the evenings, they sat by the fire in comfortable companionship, sometimes reading aloud to one another, sometimes simply talking until the candles burned low. Isabella found herself relaxing by degrees, the rigid propriety she had worn like armor slowly loosening as she realized Alexander truly wanted to know her thoughts, her preferences, her authentic self, rather than the silent, dutiful mask she had perfected over years of social training. What surprised her most was discovering parts of herself she had long suppressed or never known existed. She had opinions about literature that went beyond proper feminine appreciation of romantic poetry. She cared deeply about social reform, about the plight of working women and children in factories, about education and opportunity. She had a sharp wit that made Alexander laugh, a sound that transformed his severe features into something warm and boyish. For the first time in her 28 years, Isabella felt truly seen, truly heard, as if she were a whole person rather than merely a daughter, a burden, or now a wife defined solely by her relationship to men. The freedom of it was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Alexander, too, revealed layers beneath his cold, aristocratic exterior that society never glimpsed. He spoke honestly about his struggles with the emotional distance his father had instilled in him from childhood, the rigid expectations of ducal behavior that had shaped him into a man who struggled to express warmth or vulnerability. He confessed his ongoing guilt over Catherine's unhappiness and death, the nightmares that still haunted him, his fear that he was fundamentally incapable of being the husband he wished to be, despite his best intentions. These revelations created an intimacy Isabella had never expected from marriage, an emotional connection that felt more profound than any physical union could be. Physical affection progressed with the same careful patience Alexander showed in everything else. It began innocently enough, his hand steadying her elbow during their walks, then progressing to holding her hand as they strolled through the gardens, his fingers warm and strong entwined with hers. One evening, as they sat reading, he drew her closer, his arms settling around her shoulders in a gesture that felt protective and tender rather than possessive. Isabella found herself leaning into his warmth, feeling safe in a way she had never experienced before. The embraces when they parted for the evening grew longer, his hands resting on her waist, her palms pressed against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Each touch awakened something in Isabella, unfamiliar stirrings of desire that her mother's teachings had trained her to suppress, sensations that made her pulse quicken and her breath catch in ways that felt both thrilling and deeply improper. She was torn between this awakening desire and years of conditioning that insisted such feelings were shameful, that proper women did not experience physical longing, that her body's responses to Alexander's touch marked her as somehow wanton or improper. Yet when she hesitantly confessed these conflicting feelings to Alexander one evening, he had taken her hands in his and assured her that desire between husband and wife was natural and beautiful, not shameful, that her body's responses were signs of health and trust rather than moral failing. The conversation itself felt scandalous and liberating, this acknowledgement of physical attraction spoken aloud between them, permission given to feel what she was feeling without drowning in guilt. The turning point came on a gray afternoon during their 4th week together, when an unexpected rainstorm caught them in the estate's library, far from the main house. Her mother's advice was explicit, clinical, and utterly devoid of comfort. Tonight, when the Duke exercised his marital rights, Isabella must close her eyes and remain perfectly still, silent and unresponsive, making no sound that might suggest enjoyment or even awareness. A proper wife endured her husband's attentions without complaint, viewing the marriage bed as a duty owed, a price paid for security and respectability. She must never, under any circumstances, expect tenderness, consideration, or pleasure. Such things were not meant for women of virtue, her mother insisted, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. Men had their needs, base and animal, and women bore the burden of satisfying those needs while maintaining their dignity through absolute passivity. The intimacy of marriage, Mrs. Sinclair explained with clinical detachment, was something to be endured, survived, gotten through as quickly as possible. If Isabella remained still and silent, it would be over faster. If she showed any sign of participation, or, God forbid, enjoyment, her husband would think her wanton and lose all respect for her. Her role was submission, nothing more. Her comfort, her feelings, her body's responses were irrelevant to the transaction. This was what it meant to be a wife. Isabella listened to this counsel in numb silence, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling, her throat constricting with each cold instruction. She had known her parents' marriage was loveless, a union of obligation that had produced 3 daughters and decades of quiet resentment. But hearing her mother speak so clinically about marital intimacy as something to be endured rather than shared made Isabella's upcoming wedding night feel less like a beginning and more like a kind of death. She was to close her eyes, endure, and expect nothing. That was the sum total of her mother's wisdom after 29 years of marriage. When her mother finally left to see to last-minute preparations, Isabella remained seated before the mirror, staring at her own pale reflection with a hollow feeling expanding in her chest. This was her future. This was what marriage meant. She tried to steel herself, to find some reserve of courage or resignation that would carry her through the ordeal ahead, but all she felt was a profound, bone-deep dread settling over her like a shroud. The hours passed in a blur of preparation and movement. Her sister helped her into the simple cream silk gown, the best her family could afford, modest and appropriate for a bride past her first youth marrying into higher station. The small church filled with guests, mostly the Duke's connections, as Isabella's family had few friends of any social standing. Then the moment arrived, the organ's solemn notes filling the cold stone space, signaling that it was time. Isabella walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her mother's instructions echoing in her mind with every step, each word a weight pulling her down towards some dark inevitability. Close your eyes, endure, never expect pleasure. The mantra repeated itself with the rhythm of her heartbeat as she approached the altar where the Duke waited, his tall figure imposing in his formal attire, his expression as unreadable as ever. She could not see kindness in his face, she could not see warmth, she saw only the cold aristocratic reserve of a man fulfilling an obligation. The ceremony proceeded with formal propriety, the vicar's words washing over her in a distant drone as she stood beside this stranger who would own her body and soul according to the laws of church and crown. She spoke her vows in a voice that sounded distant to her own ears, promising to love, honor, and obey. The Duke's responses came measured and correct, his deep voice betraying no emotion whatsoever. Then came the moment for the ring. The Duke took her left hand in his, and Isabella braced herself, expecting the same cold formality that had characterized every interaction between them. But as Alexander Thornwood slid the golden band onto her finger, his touch was unexpectedly gentle, his large hand cradling hers with a carefulness that seemed almost protective. His thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture so brief and subtle that Isabella almost thought she had imagined it. For one fleeting moment, his gray eyes met hers, and she saw something flicker in their depths, something that was not quite coldness, something that whispered of complexity beneath his reserved exterior. Rain lashed against the tall windows as thunder rolled overhead, and they found themselves alone in the book-lined sanctuary, the storm creating a sense of intimacy and isolation from the rest of the world. Their conversation, which had begun with light-hearted debate about a novel they had both read, gradually deepened into something more personal. Alexander spoke of his loneliness during his first marriage, the profound isolation of sharing a home with someone who feared him. Isabella confessed her own loneliness, years of feeling invisible and worthless, resigned to spinsterhood and insignificance. As she spoke, tears escaped despite her best efforts to maintain composure, and Alexander gently wiped them away with his thumb, his touch infinitely tender. Then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to move away, Alexander cupped her face in his hands and lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was soft, questioning, exploring rather than demanding, his mouth moving against hers with a gentleness that made her breath catch and her knees weaken. Heat bloomed through Isabella's body, desire flooding through her with such intensity that it frightened her even as it thrilled her. After a long moment, Alexander drew back slightly, his gray eyes searching hers in the dim library light, his voice rough with restrained passion as he asked the question that changed everything. "Do you wish me to continue?" The choice was hers, the power was hers, and Isabella realized with sudden clarity that she did wish it desperately, that her body was crying out for more of his touch, that desire was not something to endure, but something to embrace. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. As Alexander kissed her again with deepening passion, Isabella felt the last walls of her mother's bitter teachings beginning to crumble, replaced by the revolutionary understanding that pleasure was not only possible but her right, and that true intimacy was not about endurance, but about two people choosing each other freely, completely, joyfully. That evening in the library marked the beginning of a new chapter in their marriage, one that unfolded over the following nights with a patience and care that continued to astound Isabella. When they finally consummated their marriage 3 nights later, it was entirely on her terms, in her time, with Alexander proving as attentive and generous in the marriage bed as he had promised. He guided her through the experience with gentle instruction and genuine concern for her comfort and pleasure, teaching her that physical intimacy was not the ordeal her mother had described, but something beautiful and deeply connecting when built on trust and mutual desire. He took his time with her, whispering words of reassurance and affection, checking constantly that she was comfortable, that she wanted to continue. When she tensed with nervousness, he paused, holding her close until she relaxed again. When she gasped with unexpected pleasure, he smiled against her skin and murmured encouragement, teaching her that her responses delighted rather than shamed him. The transformation in Isabella's understanding of her own body was profound. She discovered that desire was not shameful, but natural, that pleasure was not something to be guilty about, but something to be celebrated, that her responses and needs mattered as much as his. In Alexander's arms, she found parts of herself she had suppressed for years under the weight of propriety and feminine duty, aspects of her nature that were passionate, sensual, and fully alive. Their private happiness continued to deepen over the following months. They became true partners in every sense, managing the estate together, planning charitable initiatives for the surrounding villages, hosting gatherings where Isabella's opinions were valued as much as the Duke's. Alexander consulted her on business matters, sought her counsel on difficult decisions, and publicly acknowledged her contributions in ways that shocked and secretly impressed London society when they returned for the winter season. But it was in their private moments that Isabella felt most transformed. The bedroom that she had once approached with dread became a sanctuary of intimacy and joy. Alexander kept his promise that her pleasure would always come first, and in doing so, taught her that true partnership extended to every aspect of their lives together. 6 months later, as winter snow blanketed the Ashford estate, Isabella stood at the drawing-room window, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their child grew. Alexander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking?" he murmured. "I'm thinking about my mother's words," Isabella said softly, "how she told me to close my eyes and endure, how wrong she was about everything. And I'm thinking about our child, how different their life will be. They'll grow up seeing a marriage built on partnership and love, not dominance and submission." Alexander's hand covered hers on her belly as he murmured softly, "Whether daughter or son, we'll teach them that they deserve to be cherished, that their feelings matter, that love should bring joy, not suffering. We'll raise our daughters to expect partnership and pleasure, not endurance, to believe they deserve to be valued for their minds and characters, not merely their decorative value. And our sons," Isabella added, leaning back against his chest, "will teach them that true strength lies in cherishing their partners, not controlling them, that a wife's happiness and pleasure should matter as much as their own, that genuine intimacy requires two people choosing each other freely, rather than one person claiming rights over another." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the snow fall beyond the windows, before Isabella turned in his embrace, looking up at the man who had shattered every cruel expectation she'd been taught to accept. "Your pleasure comes first, always," she quoted back to him, smiling. "Those words changed my life, Alexander. They changed everything I believed about myself, about what I deserved, about what marriage could be." "No," he corrected gently, his gray eyes warm with love as he gazed down at her. "You changed everything. You had the courage to believe you deserved more than what you'd been taught to accept. You had the strength to challenge generations of poisonous teachings about female duty and submission. You saved us both, Isabella. You gave me a second chance to build the kind of marriage I should have created the first time, one built on equality, respect, and genuine love." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I was so frightened that wedding night. I was prepared to endure a lifetime of cold obligation. Instead, I found a partner who taught me that I was worthy of love, that my voice mattered, that my pleasure was important." "You were always worthy," Alexander said firmly, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "You just needed someone to help you see it, and now our child will grow up never doubting their worth, never believing that suffering is virtue, or that love means sacrifice without joy." As they stood together in the firelight, Isabella knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just love, but genuine liberation, the freedom to be fully herself, fully alive, fully human. And the child growing within her would inherit that freedom, raised in a home where partnership replaced possession, where pleasure replaced endurance, where love meant choosing each other every day. Her mother had been wrong about everything, and Isabella had been never more grateful to prove her wrong. Did Isabella's journey touch your heart? Her story proves that we all deserve love that cherishes rather than controls, partnership rather than possession. If you believe in marriages built on mutual respect and genuine affection, subscribe to Story Nook TV and ring that bell so you never miss our tales of love, courage, and transformation. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to unlearn harmful teachings about relationships? What did Isabella's transformation mean to you? Your story might inspire someone else to choose hope over resignation. Until our next tale, dear friends, may you always remember, your pleasure, your happiness, your voice, they matter, always.